They thought we would beg. They thought we would bend the knee like always. But on that sharp April morning, the leaders of Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger walked into the spotlight with something the West had never seen before. A united front, unshaken by pressure, unafraid of rejection, and unwilling to trade their dignity for loans. There were no Western consultants holding the blueprints, no IMF officials setting the rules, no World Bank suits smiling behind podiums. What the world witnessed that day was a declaration of sovereignty masked as an infrastructure project, a high-speed rail cutting across borders, defying foreign predictions and replacing decades of dependency with a vision forged entirely by African hands. This wasn't just steel and bolts on the ground. This was pride laid mile by mile. Three nations, long dismissed, long destabilized, long dictated to, rising with a plan not borrowed, but born in their own soil. The Sahel corridor was not a gift from abroad. It was a warning. We are done waiting. What made this moment even more astonishing was how they did it. Not with outside money, but with their own. The newly founded Sahel Unity Bank didn't just fund the project, it rewrote the rules of engagement. Financed through regional resources, diaspora contributions, and mutual guarantees, this bank became a fortress, a financial shield against the conditional aid traps that had crippled development for generations. Western institutions had one reaction: silence. No threats, no congratulations, just quiet disbelief. The world had grown used to a passive Africa, but now, from Ouagadougou to Bamako to Niamey, a new rhythm began. Rails were being laid, not by Chinese contractors or European firms, but by local workers trained in regional institutes. Stations rose from red earth, carved with traditional symbols, echoing heritage with every stone. The past was not being erased. It was being honored, upgraded, accelerated. And it was happening marathon. Journeys that used to take days were now possible in hours. A merchant in Mali could deliver goods to Burkina Faso before dusk. A student from Niger could travel for education in another capital without navigating broken buses and unreliable borders. Trade was no longer theory, it was motion. Let us know in the comments, do you believe this kind of unity can change the course of a continent? Can African nations truly chart their future without the permission of the old powers? The next part of this story shows just how deep this revolution runs. If you haven't already, subscribe now because what's coming is even more powerful. They called it just a railway, but what they didn't see, what they never bothered to look for, was the deeper meaning behind every track, every bolt, every station carved with symbols older than any European parliament. This was not about speed, it was about defiance. A deliberate refusal to allow the outside world to dictate what Africa builds, how it builds it, and for whom it is built. Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger were not just connecting their cities, they were reclaiming their territory. For decades, outside forces had mapped these lands with military strategies and economic forecasts, none of which served the people who lived on them. But with each new rail segment, that map was redrawn. By the people, for the people. They placed hospitals along the new corridor, schools, water points, even local factories producing rail parts, so dependency didn't crawl back in through the back door. Every kilometer wasn't just transportation, it was transformation. And let's be honest, they knew the critics would come. This is too ambitious, they said. You're under sanctions, you lack experience, you'll collapse under your own weight. But that's the thing, when you've carried the weight of imposed poverty for generations. Building your own future doesn't feel heavy, it feels liberating. It wasn't just the money they controlled, it was the narrative. No more calling their plans unsustainable. No more waiting for approval. No more being lectured by people whose own countries were built on centuries of stolen wealth. Instead, they did something terrifying to the global order. They believed in themselves, and they invited their people to believe too. Thousands of local engineers, trained under emergency scholarship programs, returned from abroad to work not in France or Germany, but in Timbuktu, in Ouagadougou, in Dosso. These weren't jobs, they were missions. Parents no longer needed to send their children away just to survive. For the first time, opportunity came to them. And here's something we rarely admit. Dignity matters more than GDP. When a young man watches his father weld a bridge that carries the future of a region, that memory is worth more than any imported aid box. When a grandmother sees her grandchildren travel safely across countries that were once splintered by artificial borders, that joy cannot be measured in currency. So yes, the trains run. But what really moves along those tracks is something deeper. Hope, self-worth, and a shared destiny no longer signed in foreign ink. If you believe dignity and unity can outperform debt and division, say it in the comments. This is your moment to speak truth to power. The next chapter will reveal how this bold project reshaped not just economies, but identities. Stay with us, and if you haven't yet, hit subscribe. What's unfolding is history in motion. And as the project gained momentum, so did the realization that something far more profound was unfolding. This wasn't just about connecting capitals with high-speed rail, it was about reprogramming the psyche of a region long shackled by imposed inferiority. For generations, the people of the Sahel had been told they were too poor to lead, too unstable to manage, too divided to unite. Those messages came in the language of reports, recommendations, and reforms, all dressed up in diplomatic grammar, but soaked in paternalism. But now the movement of trains across deserts and savannas was rewriting those assumptions in steel. The land, once seen as only good for extraction or military bases, was suddenly home to a living, breathing artery of growth, planned, funded, and built without a single foreign dictate. The conversations in homes and marketplaces shifted. Pride replaced resignation. Imagination returned. People began to ask, if we could build this, what else can we do? That question alone was dangerous to those who had long profited from the continent's despair. Unsurprisingly, certain media outlets began publishing articles questioning the safety of the railway, its economic viability, even its environmental impact. They spoke of lack of transparency, of geopolitical risk, and other abstract fears that never seemed to apply when foreign corporations strip-mined the same lands. But for once, the narrative didn't stick. People had seen with their own eyes what could be achieved when the architects of development wore familiar faces, spoke local languages, and ate the same food as the people they served. That trust, forged through inclusion, was unshakable. And more than that, it was contagious. Young professionals from Ghana, Togo, and Chad began volunteering to help expand the project. Not for money, but to be part of history. Retired engineers who had once worked under colonial ministries returned to offer mentorship. University students documented the process, uploading videos, creating archives, making sure this moment would never be forgotten or stolen. And here is where we must pause and reflect. Because no matter how fast the trains move, no matter how smooth the tracks, the real engine behind it all was a mental shift. For perhaps the first time in living memory, the people of these nations began to believe they could define their own modernity, not as a copy of Paris or Washington, but as something uniquely and proudly their own. Do you feel that too? The tremble of change beneath your feet? If this story speaks to you, tell us below. What would you like to see built next? Your voice helps shape the future. And don't forget and subscribe, because in the next part, we go deeper into the regional transformations this railway has already set in motion, and the powerful reactions it's stirring across the continent and beyond. What followed next could not be ignored, not by neighboring states, not by foreign embassies, and certainly not by the financial giants who had long dominated development talks. One by one, ministers from Ghana, Guinea, Chad, and even parts of North Africa began requesting observer status in Sahel Unity summits. They were not just curious, they were hungry for an alternative, tired of being stuck in loan cycles, of building roads that led nowhere, of waiting years for projects to break ground only after foreign permission was granted. And so the movement grew. The railway, at first meant to connect three capitals, now stretched like an open invitation to the entire region. The design allowed for branch lines, modular by intention, scalable by strategy. It was never meant to be a closed system. It was a framework for unity. But with expansion came friction. International lenders began pushing back. Offers to support the project suddenly came with familiar strings: consultants, monitoring missions, and clauses that would transfer critical decisions to technical experts from abroad. The Sahel leaders declined politely but firmly. They had already seen what such support had done to previous projects: bloated budgets, outsourced jobs, and cultural erasure. This time, they would not surrender ownership. Instead, they turned inward again, issuing new bonds, adjusting trade duties, even leveraging strategic reserves of minerals to back infrastructure insurance. Where Western systems saw risk, they saw leverage. And it worked. Confidence surged. Investment from non-Western allies like Brazil, Turkey, and Malaysia began to flow, not as dictates, but as mutual ventures. The Sahel Unity Bank didn't just manage money, it managed belief. And in doing so, it transformed itself from a tool into a symbol. For the elderly farmer who once watched his land wither under policy experiments crafted continents away, this bank was redemption. For the grandmother who had buried children lost to conflicts fueled by resource theft and aid dependency, this railway was resurrection. And for the youth, those born into a world told they had no future unless they left, this movement became a reason to stay. In a time when migration headlines filled global screens, these nations offered something rare: roots strong enough to hold and roads fast enough to carry dreams home. Are we finally seeing the blueprint for true African-led development? Let your voice be heard. Share your thoughts in the comments. What would a truly independent future look like for your community? And if you've made it this far, don't forget to subscribe, because the next part dives into how this railway is changing not just where people go, but how they live once they get there. The transformation wasn't just economic, it was human. Villages once dismissed as remote became stops along the fastest route in West Africa. Children who had never seen a paved road now watched electric trains glide past their homes. Suddenly, access wasn't a charity, it was infrastructure. In each new station, health centers emerged, equipped not with leftovers from expired Western donations, but with locally sourced materials and regional doctors. Telecommunication hubs were installed, connecting communities not just to each other, but to the world. Teachers from capital cities volunteered to relocate, inspired by a sense of purpose not seen in decades. But the most powerful shift was cultural. The Sahel Rail didn't flatten tradition, it elevated it. Architects studied the lines of ancient Sahelian mosques, the geometry of Dogon cliffs, the rhythm of Fulani music, and built these inspirations into public spaces. Waiting halls became galleries of identity. Ticket booths were painted with proverbs in multiple local tongues. This wasn't some sterile imitation of a Western transit system. This was the living language of a people, finally given steel in motion. Elders began telling stories about the land in new ways, not as sites of colonization or extraction, but as paths of connection and renewal. Youth who had never thought much about their heritage found themselves sketching railcars in notebooks, dreaming not of escaping abroad, but of expanding what they had inherited. And this mattered more than most outsiders could ever understand, because for too long, development had come with an unstated price: cultural erasure. But now, progress didn't ask them to choose between the past and the future. It invited both to travel together. Some critics still clung to doubt. They called it performative. They warned about maintenance costs, about political instability, about corruption. But the people closest to the project didn't flinch. They had seen sincerity in the calloused hands laying the track. They had eaten with the engineers and prayed beside the welders. This wasn't performative. It was personal. And with every successful journey completed, belief grew. Grandparents who once feared their families would scatter across continents now saw them reuniting at local terminals. Parents who once hesitated to send their daughters to school now felt confident they could travel safely and return home with dignity. Isn't that what every society should want? Freedom, not just to move, but to remain? If this vision resonates with you, leave your thoughts in the comments. What memories from your own journey does this awaken? And remember to subscribe because in the next section, we explore how this regional revival is beginning to change power dynamics far beyond Africa's borders. Outside the Sahel, not everyone was celebrating. In the boardrooms of old financial empires, discomfort grew. What happens when a region long seen as dependent begins to generate its own blueprints? When it no longer seeks permission to dream, build, or lead? Diplomatic cables began to circulate quietly. Analysts scrambled to explain how three fragile nations could suddenly fund, execute, and sustain a project of this magnitude without Western oversight. Think tanks published reports laced with concern, shifting alliances, loss of leverage, emerging multipolarity. But on the ground, in the homes of the very people long ignored by these analyses, none of this felt abstract. It felt urgent, tangible, alive. Farmers organized co-ops to access distant markets by train. Women-led collectives began producing handicrafts and exporting them along the corridor. Local entrepreneurs, once confined to regional fairs, now tapped into cross-border commerce with confidence. The railway became a marketplace, a messenger, a movement, and that ripple effect stretched far. In neighboring countries, students demanded similar investments. Civil society groups cited the Sahel model in budget proposals. Even diaspora communities abroad began lobbying their embassies to replicate the strategy. If they can do it without waiting for the IMF, why can't we? For the first time in years, African policy wasn't being imported. It was being exported. That terrified the gatekeepers of the old order. Offers to assist returned again, this time more politely, but laced with veiled pressure. Editorials warned of authoritarian coordination and opaque decision-making. But those words fell flat. People could see with their own eyes that something real was unfolding. After all, what could be more transparent than roads and rails you could walk on? What could be more democratic than millions of people voting with their trust and participation? Of course, no transformation is without tension. Security concerns persisted. Sabotage attempts were made. There were moments of fear. But unlike in the past, these crises didn't halt progress. They galvanized it. Communities organized their own watch groups to protect the tracks. Soldiers who once fought only insurgents were now tasked with guarding opportunity. In doing so, they no longer stood just for defense, but for development. The foreign policy manuals didn't know what to make of that. How do you classify a railway that defends identity and delivers hope? Where do you place it on a geopolitical map when its only empire is unity? If you're seeing this shift as clearly as we are, say so in the comments. What changes have you noticed in how people speak about Africa today? Your insight matters. And remember to subscribe, because what's coming next reveals just how far this idea has spread and who's trying hardest to stop it. As the Sahel model gained visibility, the question was no longer whether it worked, but how far it could spread before being contained. From Senegal to Sudan, presidents, generals, and grassroots organizers took notice. The message was too bold to ignore. You do not need permission to build your future. In Addis Ababa, whispers grew louder within the African Union. Why had no continental agency done what three militarily besieged nations had managed in mere months? Should regional blocs like ECOWAS or the East African Community not have championed such integration years ago? These weren't just rhetorical questions. They were indictments of a political order that had grown comfortable with waiting for aid, for approvals, for external guidance. The Sahel Rail, in contrast, was movement, and movement challenges stillness. Youth across the continent started organizing forums titled Post-Dependency Strategies. Former civil servants wrote public letters calling for the nationalization of critical infrastructure. And in the Sahel itself, second phases of the project had already begun. Rural extensions, agriculture-specific cargo lines, even mobile clinics attached to rail convoys for remote villages. This was not a stunt. It was a system. And like any system built on self-reliance, it drew enemies. Cyber attacks began targeting the Unity Bank servers. Fake news campaigns accused the rail consortium of corruption, tribal favoritism, and foreign manipulation. But this time, the disinformation didn't stick. Why? because the people were not observers. They were participants. A grandmother whose small millet farm now shipped to markets hundreds of kilometers away wasn't going to believe a foreign blog post claiming the trains didn't exist. A teacher whose salary arrived faster thanks to new regional payroll rails had no interest in conspiracy theories. These were not abstract beneficiaries. They were stakeholders, and they defended the truth with their voices, their presence, and in some cases, their lives. When protesters tried to sabotage a rail line in Niamey under false pretenses, it was local youth who stopped them, not the army. When journalists from abroad arrived looking for scandal, they found clean platforms, functioning schedules, and station managers who could speak 3 languages fluently, none of them European. Something deeper had changed. The people no longer felt inferior. And when inferiority dies, fear dies with it. Still, not all leaders applauded. Some feared the example. What if their own populations began asking the same questions? What if they, too, demanded self-managed banks, community-led development, sovereign infrastructure? So while many African leaders reached out to join the initiative, a few, too cozy with the old order, began quietly working to undermine it. They pressured neighboring media to downplay the project. They delayed approvals for cross-border expansions. But their resistance only exposed their irrelevance, because the idea had already gone viral, not on the internet, but in the soul. Do you feel it too, the shift? The slow but unstoppable return of pride in our own hands, our own tools, our own plans? Then say it out loud in the comments. We are not waiting anymore. And if you believe that future is worth defending, hit subscribe, because the next part shows how a train can travel beyond borders and enter the battlefield of global power. The battle was no longer about railways. It had become a battle of models, between control and cooperation, between dictated progress and chosen destiny. The old powers knew this, even if they never said it out loud. They saw what was happening in the Sahel and understood that it posed a far greater threat than any armed rebellion ever could. Because this time the threat wasn't chaos, it was competence. And competence is contagious. When people see what is possible without dependency, they begin to question everything they have been taught about their limitations. And so a silent war began, not with missiles, but with narratives. Foreign embassies increased cultural grants, launched new civil society programs, and flooded universities with scholarships, not out of generosity, but to steer the minds of the next generation back into familiar ideological territory. At the same time, subtle diplomatic pressure was applied to neighboring governments. Distance yourself from the Sahel bloc, they were told, or risk losing trade preferences, aid agreements, even military cooperation. But the timing was too late. The shift had already reached critical mass. In cities across Africa, murals of trains breaking through colonial chains appeared overnight. Poets recited verses about sovereignty at open-air festivals. Musicians wrote songs in Bambara, Zarma, and Moray, songs not just about movement, but about meaning. We are not passengers anymore, one lyric went. We are the conductors of our fate. In boardrooms, that kind of awakening is terrifying, because it means you can't bribe it, you can't bomb it, you can't broker it. You can only try to outshine it, and that's not easy when your hands are stained with centuries of exploitation. International think tanks scrambled to offer a counter-narrative. Yes, Africa can build railways, but not without external safeguards. Yes, regional unity is noble, but it must include proper Western alignment. These words no longer inspired trust. They inspired laughter. The world had watched as Western-backed regimes collapsed under corruption and incompetence, while 3 sanctioned nations laid down one of the most ambitious infrastructure projects in modern African history. So who really needed supervision? Who should be advising whom? Meanwhile, the Sahel governments, though aware of the pressure, didn't waste time on arguments. They kept building. New tenders were issued for agricultural corridors. Mineral-rich zones were linked directly to processing plants instead of foreign ports. Engineers designed solar-powered carriages to serve villages off the main electric grid. These weren't symbols, they were systems, functioning, replicable, scalable systems. And with every completed track, every functioning schedule, every empowered community, the balance of moral authority shifted. No longer could the West claim to be the sole voice of responsible development. The proof was thundering down the rail lines of West Africa, car by car, bridge by bridge, heartbeat by heartbeat. What does this mean for the rest of the world? That a new chapter has begun, and it's not being written in Paris, London, or Washington, but in Mopti, Kaya, and Zinder. Do you see the same shift happening around you? Share it below. Your voice belongs in this global awakening. And stay close, because in the final part, we explore what happens when a generation raised on dependency suddenly inherits the tools of leadership. In the heart of every revolution lies a quiet question. What if we are enough? For generations, that question was drowned out by statistics, reports, and foreign consultants. It was dismissed as naive, romantic, even dangerous. But in the dust and heat of the Sahel, it was asked again, not in words, but in action. Steel laid by local hands, engines assembled with indigenous knowledge, communities connected not just by technology, but by trust. And in answering that question, the people of Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger rewrote not only their future, but the terms of what future even means. No longer was development something to be delivered. It became something to be claimed. That shift echoes far beyond the rails. In classrooms, children now study case studies written in their own languages. In parliaments, bills are introduced to expand sovereignty-driven banking. In homes, elders who once spoke in hushed tones about resistance now tell stories of how dignity returned on iron wheels. Across the continent, something long buried has begun to rise again. Self-respect, the kind that doesn't shout or boast, but builds, relentlessly, quietly with purpose. And it is this dignity, not military might, not corporate deals, not approval from think tanks, that may prove to be Africa's most powerful export in the 21st century. Already a second unity bank is being explored in Central Africa. Engineers from the Sahel are mentoring teams in East Africa. Delegations from South America and Southeast Asia have begun requesting technical partnerships, not to teach, but to learn. Imagine that. The world asking Africa how to build. For many elders, this moment is bittersweet. They remember the promises of independence, the betrayals that followed, the decades of stagnation. But now, at last, they see that the fire never died. It only waited for new fuel. That fuel came not from speeches or sanctions, but from the decision to stop waiting. Waiting for approval, waiting for perfection, waiting for someone else to care. Instead, the people built, and in doing so, they reminded the world that sovereignty is not given, it is taken, nurtured, and rebuilt every single day. So as this train rumbles forward from dusty stations to shining terminals, it carries more than cargo. It carries a message. We are not what you thought. We are what we choose. Let that be the lesson. Let that be the legacy, and let it never again be forgotten. If this journey has touched something in you, if you feel the echo of that deeper question, what if we are enough? Then speak. Write it, share it, say it out loud. We are not passengers anymore. We are the conductors, and our tracks, once broken and abandoned, now stretch toward a future no longer borrowed, but truly our own. Subscribe now and stay close, because what began with steel and ambition has become something far more powerful, a movement of minds, of memories, and of meaning.